Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Welcome to the seventh of our series on beauty. Last week's lecture was on beauty and happiness, and this week we go to the other extreme of beauty and terror. Over the centuries there's been no shortage of tyrants who've sponsored the arts, but in the 20th century, perhaps more than ever, tyrants have tended to actively use the arts as political instruments. So it's very appropriate that our title should be Beauty by Terror, Russo-Soviet Perspectives. Now, our speaker is Yevgeny Dobryenko, who's Professor of Russian and Slavonic Studies at Sheffield University. He's a Ukrainian who gained his doctorate in Russian literature at Odessa before he moved to Moscow, and then he went from Moscow to the United States, teaching at Duke University, among other universities. In the year 2000, he moved to Nottingham University and then on to Sheffield, where he is now, of course, in 2007. Professor Dobryenko's voluminous publications cover the whole range of artistic activity of the Soviet and actually post-Soviet era, film, visual arts, literature, and so on. And a recurring theme in them, I understand, has been the paradoxical role that beauty has played in the imposition of power. It's a pleasure to introduce Professor Dobryenko.
First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for the courageous choice of the topic for this year Darwin College lecture series, because even talking about the beauty, the topic of beauty is a challenge to the present status quo, as this subject, which was earlier so urgent and widely discussed, even if it was in a highly negative context, as for example in the era of modernism, and became the basis for an entire discipline, aesthetics, has lost its former popularity. The subject of beauty became unfashionable, even a sign of aesthetic and political retrogression. Why did it happen? There was, of course, a tradition formulated back in the modernist era that linked beauty to the past and therefore considered an interest in it to be a manifestation of obscurantism. Nonetheless, the reason that is much later and much more felt by us today is that beauty was inextricably linked to the terrible totalitarian experience of the 20th century. This is why many consider it fundamentally blasphemous to use positive aesthetic categories, and the most sacred among them, beauty, in the description of totalitarian cultures. Poetry and beauty right along with it is impossible after Auschwitz. It seems even more impossible, so to speak, during Auschwitz. And was it not right of Umberto Eco to simply omit this dark olivace of the 20th century history in his landmark anthology on beauty, A History of Western Idea, starting with the aesthetic ideal of ancient Greece and ending with the beauty of machines, abstract forms, provocation and consumption? Eco does not even mention totalitarian beauty, as if the revival of beauty and the production of totalitarian kitsch in Nazi Germany, Franco Spain, Stalinist Russia, or indeed Eco's native Italy of 1932 when he was born, never happened. Or as if this painful period of history did not constitute an epicenter of the Western history of the 20th century. The problem here is purely perceptual. Beauty is always tied to truth, happiness, and harmony. And it always has a highly positive aura. One cannot deny, however, another important fact. Beauty is always tied to art. Art has always been situated close to power, whether sacred or secular. Power is also always based on coercion. Hence, one might say that coercion is the subconscious of beauty, and beauty is sublimated violence. And in fact, all of aesthetics, as Terry Eagleton has so acutely observed, is, I quote, no more than a name for the political unconscious. It is simply the way social harmony registers itself on our senses, imprints itself on our sensibilities. The beautiful is just political order lived out on the body, the way it strikes the eyes and stirs the heart, end quote. Beauty always appeals to harmony, order, and law. It has always been thought that the higher the degree of social organization, the more fully the essence of beauty and harmony, as opposed to chaos and anarchy, is manifested in it. And it is no accident that the very idea of beauty developed in bosom of the church for centuries. Secularism, however, is tied to democratization, i.e., with the disintegration of the existing order. And what comes to replace beauty is the sublime. The 20th century was one that saw 2 world wars and terrible terroristic regimes. The rearguard battles of patriarchal societies with the new age, with individualism, capitalism, progress, and political modernization, turned out to be much more terrible and bloodier than the first skirmishes in the 19th century. In traditional societies, beauty is visible and palpable, and therefore it is indeed the most real legitimization of the ancien regime. Using beauty as cover, traditional societies defend themselves from modernity. What was called beauty in Europe, in 1930s Europe, was in fact the sublime, the very notion of which was by no accident the product of the new age. It is a traumatic reaction to the challenge of individualism. On the whole, aesthetics deals with social trauma. With some intent, Nietzsche called aesthetics applied psychology. This is why sublime, as the most typical of all aesthetic moods, is so central. It is always traumatic, as it is a desacralized, decadent, fallen beauty, one that has become secular and devoid of divine grace. The sublime is an expression of the shock of the individual confronting the absolute. This is just the variety of the sublime on which Romanticism and Classicism fed. The totalitarian sublime has a quite different origin. It feeds off the trauma of the collective experience of the patriarchal, culturally immature masses when this experience is shaken by terror. This kind of experience has no internal freedom, since it is completely swallowed up by the interiorization of terror. Thus, it can produce nothing but a surrogate. Its product is totalitarian kitsch. But totalitarian regimes need the sublime not only for the psychological interiorization of its own grandeur by individuals, but also to conceal its purely repressive essence. Beauty is the unarticulate idea of the absolute, embodied in images. It can only be represented. The sublime, by contrast, is the idea of the absolute that has no representation and cannot be embodied. Any attempt to embody it is deliberately inadequate. Beauty appeals to the ready-made image, while the sublime appeals to the autonomy of subjective experience, to individual freedom. Beauty is tied to ethics. What ethics calls good, art portrays as the beautiful. This is not the case with the sublime, which is so immersed in traumatic experience that it is generally indifferent to ethics. Beauty cannot be conceived without truth. It is a manifestation of truth. But the sublime is different to truth. One could also say that the beautiful is an established world, while the sublime is a world in a process of formation. The beautiful is the petrified sublime. There are different ways of looking at the relationship between them. Not if you would say that beauty is by far more elevated, since it appeals to an absolute, while the sublime is just a conflict between the ideal and the individual, which seeks to perfected forms but fails to find them. There are also many who, on the contrary, suppose that beauty is petrifaction and fetish, while the sublime itself is full of life, emotional experience, and exaltation. Be that as it may, beauty in the 20th century has always been turned into a basis for anti-modernist hysterics, or, on the other hand, was a constant target for the modernist attacks. So it is no coincidence that what is posited as new, as a break with tradition, is almost always perceived as a challenge to beauty. But this is only one aspect of the sublime. Another side of it is a profound internal disharmony. Edmund Burke directly stated that the source of the sublime is that which is capable of causing suffering or danger, everything that is horrible and by no means what is beautiful. Therefore, we will not err if we say that the source of the sublime is fear. In fact, what we understand as totalitarian beauty is nothing other than sublimated terror. And that is why these images are full of profound trauma. Behind their pompous grandeur, monumental harmony, and transcendency lies entropy, violence, and horror of annihilation. Famous Burke's definition of sublime, delightful horror. Totalitarian cultures did not know beauty. In their pomposity, monumentalism, and megalomania, there is not only a political dimension, but also an aesthetic one. The exalted forms of the sublime passed off as the beautiful. The sublime seeks to pass for the beautiful because precisely what these cultures needed was beauty that would appeal to truth. What is beautiful is true, cannot be false. Hence the enormous legitimizing potential of beauty. In Judeo-Christian tradition, the link between beauty and truth is asserted via a link between beauty and freedom. But something quite different is also true. The obvious connection between beauty and unfreedom. Evgeny Zamyatin's dystopian novel, We, begins with this remarkable diary entry by the hero, I quote, "Ballet, square harmony. Why beautiful? Why is the dance beautiful? Answer, because it is unfree movement. Because the deep meaning of the dance is contained in its absolute ecstatic submission, in the ideal non-freedom. It is true that our ancestors, if it's true that our ancestors would abandon themselves in dancing at the most inspired moments of their lives, religious mysteries, military parades, then it means only one thing. The instinct of non-freedom, as beautiful itself, has been characteristic of human nature from ancient times, end quote. In the process of creating a harmonized nation, all dictatorships realized the cult of beauty in basically similar forms of theatricalization, sacralization, mythologization, the production of visual superreality, and finally in the project itself of creating of a new man. I would like to address, however, what made these cultures different in the ways they realized this cult of social harmonization. That beauty acquired different forms in the different dictatorships is beyond doubt. In Soviet Russia, for example, which lagged behind Western civilization with respect to technology, the collision between patriarchal culture and this Western civilization was so extreme that it gave rise to the most radical forms of industrial avant-garde art. Complete rejection of beauty. French Cubists, German Dadaists, and Italian Futurists all, of course, proclaimed the destruction of beauty. There is nothing new in it. Essentially, modernism is nothing but a revolt against the former ideal of beauty. But the extreme radicalism of the Russian rejection of beauty is tied to the uniqueness of Russian situation. As opposed to the West, modernization here was introduced from outside, and it collided with deeply patriarchal culture. The gap between westernized modernist project and traditional patriarchal reality was shocking, and the population unreadiness for it was enormous. But at least in one respect, Russian situation was above this difference. Soviet modernization was based on similar social premise, tied to democratization of social order. Such democratization became a religion of the new age. It led to profound political implications as well as aesthetic ones. The democratization of traditional societies is a complex and dangerous process, since these societies are often not only unprepared for liberalization, but actively oppose it. In this respect, the breakdown into a new Middle Age in the 20th century was no accident. Each mobilizational regime saw itself not as a continuation of history, but as a corrective of it. Fundamental to each is a rejection of the course of the historical process that aims at secularization, modernization, individualism, and the rejection of patriarchal values and the peasant way of life. These regimes attempted to turn history backwards, and in doing so, they referenced antiquity. It allowed them to skip over the detested liberal bourgeois period, as if starting all over again, and simultaneously it guaranteed continuity. Since the 20th century was the century of the cult of progress, all of the totalitarianism that grew out of revolutions and war positioned themselves as progressive, oriented toward the future and to ideas of national revival. Hitler constructed his 1,000-year Reich. The Soviet Union laid a path for humanities to the bright world of eternal communism. These regimes rushed towards economic modernization. The main thing that made them alike was the answer to the question of the value and the boundaries of modernizing projects. In them, the price paid for economic modernization was political conservation. the social status quo, and historical revenge. Essentially, these regimes were oriented not to the future, but to the past. Modernization in them were realized in the name of preservation of, or a return to, the pre-capitalist, peasant, patriarchal, and feudal militaristic past. Paradoxically, modernization was not supposed to let the future come, but rather to preserve these traditional societies. Having gone backward, they took even their aesthetic ideals from the past. Thus, at the heart of these societies lies the idea of retardation, preservation rather than transformation of the traditional order. Hence the orientation to exemplars from the past, from antiquity. At the ideological level, this society relies on priestly rather than legal practices, on morality rather than law, on the faith rather than rationality. Hence the reliance on a mystical principle, on the sublime past of as beauty. If for the modernist beauty was the modernist beauty was the future, then for totalitarian regimes such beauty was the present, to the degree that it drew its inspiration from the past. In the name of traditional beauty, Nazi culture rejected degenerative modernism, and Stalinism fought against formalism and explained to Shostakovich and Eisenstein that the language of art must be simple and accessible to the broad masses. Both campaigns, by the way, were in fact running in parallel in 1936 and 1937 at the height of the Great Terror in the USSR. One need only examine the plans and sketches for the reconstruction of Moscow in mid-30s to understand that Stalinism rejected rationalism and functionalism in favor of an exuberant Baroque, an exaltation of formal decoration. Stalinism appeals not so much to rational forms as to the things that struck the peasants pouring into the cities in the 1920s and 30s. Empire style, the church, and the decorations of rich interiors. Neither in Germany, not even less so in Italy, did the masses experience such a culture shock, since they lived in a completely different visual milieu. One needs only look at the station of the Moscow metro in order to glimpse the development of the forms of the Tsarist tower. These forms and stylizations modeled the patriarchal imagery and were the embodiment of the archetype of the ideal dwelling of yesterday's peasant. In Stalinism, this hinged on a no less radical appeal to an ancient ideal of beauty, specifically to Greece and Rome. Never mind that practically all the European dictatorships hark back to them. Stalinism reproduced this ideal stylistically in a most consistent way. In Abraham Rome's 1934 film A Strict Youth, discussions about the new socialist morality takes place in a stadium as if brought directly from Greece and Rome into the Union of Soviets. Even the poses that the characters assume are Greek. In the Stalinist era, art is only a reflection of the beauty of the Soviet life. Generally speaking, the rejection of utility in favor of self-sufficient beauty reaches no less a degree of radicalization in Stalinist culture than the productionism that had preceded it in the rejection of beauty in favor of utility. In Germany, the rejection of traditional beauty in Dadaism and Expressionism were motivated by a completely different reason: the unwillingness of the artistic elites to stay within the paradigm of bourgeois beauty. The modernist impulse had a different basis than it did in Russia. This is why the Nazi rejection of degenerative art was interpreted as a return to folk culture that was designed with the myth of blood and soil as a point of departure. Stylistically, this was formulated with reference to Rome, but with a strong Nordic component that was not present in Stalinism. One needs only glance at the Imperial Chancellery and Ministry of Propaganda buildings erected in Berlin to see the difference between Stalinist Baroque and the restrained Nazi Empire style. The difference is even more obvious when comparing the two main architectural projects of Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia: the Germania project in Berlin and the Palace of Soviets in Moscow. Megalomania unites these two projects. The Germania project, the creation of a new capital for the 1,000-year Reich instead of Berlin, intended to construct the highest cupola in the world, alongside which the Brandenburg Gates, it's over here. And for the matter of fact, all Berlin would seem like a grain of sand. But the Stalinist Palace of Soviets was conceived as the tallest building in the world. On the top of the palace, a 120 meters statue of Lenin. 120 meters was to be erected. This pinnacle of Stalinist megalomania was supposed to be the palace for the people, combining the pomposity of the Egyptian pyramids, the grandeur of ancient Rome, and the sanctity of temple architecture. The Palace of Soviets is an example of the use of traditional sacred images of beauty for secular political purposes. It was to stand in the site of Moscow's largest cathedral, which was demolished in 1931. These projects are similar. However, serious stylistic differences begin to appear and are especially obvious when one compares the art of Stalinism, Nazism, and Italian fascism. These are most famous images, of course, Stalinist architecture, Nazi, and Italian under Mussolini. Futurism was still an officially recognized art in painting, and the so-called rationalist fascist style was dominant in Italian architecture. This latter was far removed from ancient Rome's exemplars of beauty, of course, and in fact relied on constructivism, mainly because the broad masses in Italy, as opposed to those in Russia, lived in a surrounding of classical beauty. And therefore, revolutionary culture suggested something different to them. For the Soviet masses, the Tsar's palaces was such a something. But for the Italians, it was constructivism, which removed the decorative element from the classical beauty surrounding them. In Germany, the reference to ancient Rome were combined with constructivist severity. But in Russia, empire style was represented in an almost Baroque style of execution. By contrast, the art of Franco's Spain combined empire style with Catholic kitsch, a clear example of which are the Basilica and Franco's tomb in the Valley of the Fallen. It's over here. I just want you to compare. This is, of course, this is Italy. This is Nazi Germany. This is post-war Moscow. Again, Italy, Spain, Soviet Union. This is actually Kiev, not Moscow, just for change. It was, if we compare the facades and oval colonnades in Italian, Nazi, Spanish, and Soviet architecture, the stylistic difference strikes us vividly. As follows from the preceding, I would argue the importance of the aesthetic dimension, and therefore of taking an aesthetic approach to different totalitarian regimes. We have to evaluate the importance of Stalinist, Nazi, and fascist beauty from a viewpoint of the social trauma condensed in these cultures. Derealization of life achieved a truly finished form in it. In this aestheticized world, everything was immersed into such a nirvana of style that consumption of this art might well be compared to the effect of profound anesthesia. Indeed, the more pain society must endure, the more and stronger anesthetic it needs. That is, the more beautiful life has to become. Ultimately, the ability of Soviet society to endure terror was directly profound to the unbearable beauty of Stalinism. The total aestheticization of politics, however, is not by any means tied only to the instrumentalization of aesthetics to strengthen the effectiveness of propaganda, nor only to the creation of a mass society, nor only to the development of technologies, not to severely traumatize society's rejection of rationalism. It is also linked with the aesthetic nature of the totalitarian state itself. The ideal artist, writer, or architect is someone who brings a plan and realizes it according to his vision, with no concessions to reality. That is, he holds full authority over reality. In other words, he is the leader. The leader was not simply represented as an artist demiurge, an architect, painter, or poet. He, in fact, was such an artist. In completing the creative act, an artist demiurge transforms reality by subjugating it to his artistic will. Reality is his raw material, which is harmonized as a result of the creative force exerted by the artist over the material. As a matter of fact, the content of the creative act is precisely in this act of exertion of will. And thus, it is congruent to the exercise of political will. In the Soviet Union, the leader was proclaimed to be the embodiment of, I quote, the objectively beautiful. If we compare the visual renderings of the leader's images in different totalitarian cultures, we see that the unrealized fantasies of the masses are transferred onto the leader, the Führer, il Duce, el Caudillo. The structure of the patriarchal authoritarian family facilitates this displacement. As William Reich demonstrated in his classical book, The Mass Psychology of Fascism, as long ago as in 1933, this is precisely the source of the national narcissism that sublimates the emotional enslavement of an individual into the cult of the nation, and in Soviet case, the cult of the hegemonic class. Reich said in 1933 what did not become a commonplace until the late 20th century. The masses unknowingly wanted fascism. And one might add Stalinism and the other dictatorships that ruled the world in the 20th century and continuing to rule it in the 21st. This order could not have been imposed upon them against their will. The aggressive potential of the traditional societies in crisis situations is enormous. The frustration of the masses with their inability to adequately respond to the challenges of modernization, limitless. And the leader simply reveals them, and through the institutions of political power directs and realizes them. Fascism, Stalinism, and Nazism are all primarily the problem of the masses and not of Hitler, Stalin, Mussolini, or Mao Zedong. The list might be lengthened by many other names of currently active political figures. If Mussolini was portrayed in futuristic way, this first portrait, avant-garde style, then Hitler, on the contrary, was portrayed romantically. Each of these leaders harked back to his own exemplar. Franco was portrayed according to the classic parade portrait. Mussolini styled himself after a Renaissance era portrait. This is my favorite one. Hitler in the manner of Duha, or a romantic landscape. In Salazar's and Stalin's cases, the romantic landscape is of emptiness and solitude, definitely relies on an emphatically realist style. Beauty is linked with sacrality. But although all these regimes had very different relationships to God and were often based on theomachism, iconoclasm, and atheism, in actuality, they were not, of course, essentially secular. Not coincidentally, did they always make a reference to the people and to popular spirit, as they saw in them either an expression of ideals of the progressive class, in the Soviet case, or as a higher race in the Nazi case, or as a defenders of nation and tradition in the Italian case, or as the exponents of traditional patriarchal and Catholic virtues in Franco's Spain or Salazar's Portugal, etc., etc. In this respect, Stalinist culture is particularly interesting since it could allow itself to officially proclaim atheism while nonetheless preserving all the attributes of sacrality in the cult of leaders. Why could this happen in Soviet Russia? Because being completely demiurgic, it simply duplicated the sacrality in itself. It had no need of an external God. everything that these cultures present is a beautiful image of the common people. The people are the definitive referent of terror. They are the source of terror, which is simply formulated ideologically and institutionalized politically by the reigning power. The people are, in fact, the mouthpiece of the ultimate will. And therefore, they become a subject equal to God, or rather, they cease to need God. For this reason, they become the only object of the cult. The atheism of a terror that relies on collective bodies and includes God in itself in the form of a people is the atheism of a new religion capable of feeding a social life based on coercion with itself. Art imposes upon us much more profound, even archetypical notions of the greatness of the people than a simple visual image. Furthermore, without art, these people cannot be created. Just as a church is an institution for maintaining and promoting a religious cult, totalitarian regimes are institutions for maintaining and promoting the cult of the patriarchal masses. Totalitarian dictatorships engaged in the production of collective bodies. Totalitarian art is the production of collective identity. Accordingly, it is one of the basic elements of these regimes, no less important than the KGB, the Gestapo, or the Gulag. Essentially, art takes the place of the church. Hence, as we have seen, these cultures manifest a special status for the shaping of public spaces. Thus, also the reliance on convention in the form of traditional beauty, transformed and sublimated, and on the collective identity rather than on the personality of the artist. This culture always harks back to folklore and to the epic canon, in which not only the ontological irrationality of these cultures, but also their genealogy are manifested. Their references to the land and fertility and to blood and soil reveal the peasant origin of what is imagined by the new proletarianized urban masses, who, although they have been subjected to urbanization, have continued to see themselves in a specifically folkloric context. To interiorize terror, these masses need the primordial beauty of an epic. Striking in Soviet painting are the pictures that portray total exaltation that is inseparable from the land and fertility. In these pictures, these two are from Moscow Metro. First two. In these pictures, one can read the genealogy of the gays in Stalinist culture. We are confronted with a pure exemplar of the sublime. These masses see only in the pitch dark of the non-existent. That is, they see not what is, but only their own unrealized possibilities. It is just these possibilities that block in these collective bodies the vision of themselves as the bodies to which something is happening. Another point of reference, as we have seen, is classical antiquity. Its visual representations are in architecture, in its reliance on the people. Stalinist architecture Stalinist architecture harks back to the exemplars of folk art. This is particularly evident in the All-Union Agricultural Exhibition 1939, wherein the pavilions combine images of abundant fruits, femininity, fertility, a surplus of agricultural products, and an abundance of fountains. The exhibition was described as an exemplar of beauty. It was itself a work of art and brought realized socialism together with beauty. In identifying with his own image in the exhibition, the spectator himself adorned, since, as a reviewer wrote, I quote one of the reviewers, an important feature of the exhibition is that the achievements in the area of agriculture and industry are directly tied in the conscience of the Soviet people to a sense of the beauty of that they have made with their own hands. If this beauty was handmade, then the beauty of the female body in its natural state might be considered the best stylistic indicator. The woman, as you see, this is Soviet row, and this is Nazi one. The woman in Soviet painting is always represented as the embodiment of quietness, simplicity, and joyful labor, which is especially emphasized when she is styled after ancient models. Female nudity is so rare here that it even became a subject of discussion in Boris Yakovlev's painting Dispute About Art, 1946, the central one. It's quite interesting painting, 1946, against a backdrop of a revolutionary and battle canvases. An almost Rubenesque Diane is depicted. In Nazi painting, the woman is presented in a completely different way, full of exaltation and sensuality. But specifically because the Soviet woman is portrayed much more realistically, in Soviet visual art, the evolution of the Soviet ideal of beauty is quite apparent in the history of the change in female images. In the revolutionary era poster, women were portrayed as revolutionaries and soldiers. And quite often images were created through montage. This is a very famous one, over here. In the first 5-year plan era, the images were primarily of working women, and in the later 30s, female images were athletic and healthy. 30s, 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 30s. However, by the time of late Stalinism, post-World War II, we see a woman in a commercial poster that reflects the post-war Stalinist style of luxury. The austerity of revolutionary times has passed and has been replaced with the new bourgeois values. The woman is no longer presented as a model of proletarian humility. She drinks from the bourgeois elegant crystal wine glass. This is a commercial of Soviet champagne, over here. And far from proletarian champagne. Or else she is busy with such quite a feminine thing as buying beautiful fabrics, over here, which was completely alien to the way Soviet woman was depicted in revolution and at labor, looking rather more like a man. It's very interesting to compare this one, this poster, with this one. Just compare these two. Petty bourgeois beauty became a luxury and permeated Soviet everyday life, as it was officially presented, of course. As opposed to the other European totalitarian dictatorships, Stalinism lasted a long time and died very slowly. Perhaps this is why Stalinism alone produced a reflective tendency in art, a curious postmodern wonderland. Two Moscow conceptualist artists, Vitaly Komar and Alexander Melamid, emigrated to the United States in the 1970s, where they created a new style called soc art, following the example, of course, pop art. This style parodies Soviet political imagery, subverting and taking it to a real level of absurdity. I took just three paintings from this whole series, nostalgic socialist realism series. And these are precisely the beauty of Stalinist empire style, that it's at the center of this picture. In the pictures, socialist realism, this is socialist realism. And another one, Stalin and Muses. Stalin's figures in a classicist setting surrounded by ancient goddesses. In view of the Kremlin in a romantic landscape, the central one, this one, a red curtain is held open by unseen hand to reveal a beautiful landscape, complete with ruins, as if the Soviet empire has become the real ancient Rome, a new ancient Rome, and the Kremlin floating like a fairy tale castle on an island in an azure sea. Traditional beauty visualizes the traumatic experience of unrealized Soviet greatness, producing a quasi-futuristic and simultaneously nostalgic post-Soviet phantasmagoria. To conclude, Dostoevsky famously asserted that beauty will save the world. The history of the 20th century, in which political beauty dominated, that is, there was simply no distinction between beauty and utility, does not inspire optimism. But let us make no mistake, beauty is inseparable from political utility, in the same way that religion is inseparable from politics. Essentially, beauty is the religion of secular society. That is why the politicization of beauty and the beautification, i.e. aestheticization of politics, I refer to Walter Benjamin, of course, in the 20th century, were the response to the total social secularization of the new age. We must not forget either, however, that this is a purely Western phenomenon. In obscurantist societies and traditional, let's say, forms of despotism, wherein religion successfully opposes secularity, religion specifically is the driving and legitimizing force of politics. Therefore, it would be correct to say that beauty, along with religion, is only one of the functions of the spiritual essence of mankind. Both of them refer to a utopia of collective salvation. Beauty is the paradise lost of the New Age person. In order to save the world, to paraphrase Dostoevsky, beauty must emerge from the shadow of the sublime. That is, it must again become a religion. The price of salvation for the European man in this case would be a return to the Middle Ages. Thank you for your attention.
While Professor Dobrenko was talking, I was struggling to try and remember those lines from Yeats about the centre will not hold, a terrible beauty is born, written of I think of the rebellion and civil war in Ireland. We've just had a wonderful account of the use of buildings to inspire awe. I couldn't help but think that our great contemporary building of Cambridge, the University Library, is undoubtedly designed to inspire awe. How many different facets? Art to identify the work of the leader with the people. Art to identify the leader with myths. Art as the production, as a process of production of collective identity. And of course, there was some very fine art in all those images, some technically superb painters. The use of beauty to legitimize the regime's underlying terror and brutality. And I suppose ultimately what I come away with the wonderful paradox that socialist realism was anything but realistic. For a fascinating talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.